The Dallas Cowboys are way over the salary cap, but we'll tell you how they could free up almost $100 million of cap space next.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us the number one sports podcast network. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. He is Landon McCool. And on today's show, we are answering your Twitter questions, including who are the top defensive ends the Cowboys could target on the market? Should they be looking for something different in their pass rushers now that they're going to be going to more of a 3-4 defense? But we're going to start with this question, Landon. There's a lot of fans out there that are getting excited about the potential of the Cowboys being more aggressive in free agency. But I think they're a little concerned because you go over to websites like Over the Cap or Spot Track and you see that they are currently $29 million over the cap right now. How concerned should fans be?
Not that concerned. I mean, I think that the Cowboys have a ton of different mechanisms for freeing up a bunch of money, as you just teased earlier in the beginning of the episode. And I think that this is kind of why the Cowboys have been very meticulous about the way that they structure their contracts. I think, in some ways, maybe to their own chagrin, like in the case of Micah Parsons specifically. And frankly, Dak didn't seem to want to bite too much on this stuff, but there are mechanisms in a bunch of the top end contracts for the Cowboys that allow them to pull triggers, move around some guaranteed money and free up cap space. And I feel like the Cowboys are going to pull several of those and free up a whole bunch of money.
All right, so let's do this together because I think this is the best way to go through the exercise. Right now on Over the Cap, the Cowboys are $29 million over the cap right now. And again, that's a rough number, and we're just going to deal with rough numbers here. We don't need to be super specific, but generally you also need about $10 million to sign a draft class. So we're going to go with the assumption the Cowboys are $39 million over the cap. And a couple more things. George Pickens, if the Cowboys want to franchise tag him, that would be $28.8 million. I'm assuming you're okay doing that as a placeholder, correct?
Of course, yes.
Okay. And then there's the two offensive linemen, TJ Bass and Brock Hoffman. They are both restricted free agents. You can give them a first-round tender, which means that they're going to get paid about $8 million a year, a second-round tender, which is $5.8 million, or an original round tender, which I believe is $2.8. Now, if you give them the original round tender, that means they can hit free agency and they can sign with any team. A second round tender means they could hit free agency, but if they sign a bigger deal, teams would have to give them a second round pick. I think it's safe to assume that a second round tender is probably the play here.
Yeah, I mean it's a good price point, right? It's just under 3 million. You said
it's 5.8 for the.
I'm sorry, for the second round. Yes. So yeah, 5, like just under 6. So, and if you're thinking about what we're talking about here, Bass and Hoffman, both borderline starting offensive linemen. I think that that's pretty reasonable, and that there's a lot of certainty that goes there as well. And I also think that second round tender is enough that it might be enticing for some teams. And maybe that's a little bit what you're interested in, right? Like is potentially getting an offer for one of these.
And maybe it doesn't have to be a second round tender. But it could be maybe a fourth, right? Maybe you negotiate it's a fourth. I wouldn't be surprised if they picked one of these two to give a second round tender to, and the other one they give an original round tender to see if they could save some money. But I don't want to get too hung up on that. Let's get to some more guys. But that puts the Cowboys in, and then you give Reddy Stewart the exclusive restricted free agent number. That puts you at $66 million over the cap. And I know there's going to be a lot of people that hear that number and they freak out, but let's go through some of these restructures, Landon. The first one, and again, a restructure, can you explain to the listener what a restructure is? Because I do think there are people that maybe don't quite understand what this is.
As I understand it, it's mostly about triggering mechanisms inside the contract to convert what would normally be salary capped money into guarantees that are not underneath the purview of the salary cap. So the player doesn't lose any money. It just converts and guarantees that money for that player, and then changes it into a guaranteed, into the kind of guaranteed bucket, which doesn't necessarily fall under the salary cap bucket.
Correct. So what this does is it lowers their base salary. It gives them basically a bigger signing bonus or check right away. Players love restructured, so they're not taking a pay cut. But the Cowboys could restructure Dak Prescott, and they would save $31 million. A couple others, you can restructure CeeDee Lamb, you would save $19 million, and you can restructure Tyler Smith. That would give you $17 million. You do all three of those together, and again, with the assumption that you are $66 million over the cap, $76 million if you're including the draft picks. That puts you all the way down to $2 million under the cap with just those three restructures. And honestly, I would expect all of them to happen.
Yeah, and those aren't the only ones that you can do. It's just all just those three though will do basically the whole trick for you. So, and that's why we're not panicked, right? Is because they have more levers to pull here if they want, and it's only going to take a few to kind of get them back in line with what they need, where they need to be.
Yeah, two other ones that are very realistic. We're not going to pull the trigger here on those ones, but Osa Odighizuwa, they could restructure him, save $12 million. They could also do it with Deron Bland. That would save you almost $9 million. So that's an extra $21 million if you want to go ahead and do that. But we'll leave those ones off right now. Let's get to some cut candidates. Logan Wilson, $6.5 million if the Cowboys release him. I'm going to go ahead and say yes.
Let's go ahead. Let's just go ahead and do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a couple other minor ones in there that are like $1 million ones, including like Israel Abaconda, Malik Davis. I could see the Cowboys doing those, but the one I wanted to ask you about is Jonathan Mingo. $2 million if you decide to cut him outright. It would not cost you any in dead money. I mean, I know the idea is that you probably want to bring him to camp and see what it looks like, but if you're re-signing George Pickens, you have Kevontae Turpin under contract, you love what you saw from Ryan Flournoy, you just cut your losses and move on?
I don't know. I mean, I think you might want to consider like signing him to maybe a 2-year deal and kind of maybe adding a void year or something, because or maybe you just decide to move on. You could do that. I just think that it's a lot to ask. You've got Flournoy, who you feel comfortable with, but to ask Tolbert and Mingo to both be gone, it's putting a lot of eggs in not a lot of receiver baskets, and so I would prefer maybe someone who's a little bit more experienced to be back. But then again, Mingo wasn't terribly experienced, nope. so maybe you figure something out there, or maybe you go get a cheap veteran that you like.
Couple more. Terrence Steele. He's got a cap number of $18 million this year with no guaranteed money left. If you cut him outright, you save $8.7 million, but you do take on $9 million of dead money this year. If you designate him as a post-June 1 cut, you can save $14 million this year, and you spread the dead cap over 2 years. Are you cutting Terrence Steele to save $14 million?
I don't think I am. I think he, to me, is a re-sign candidate, right? Like, or contract mechanism candidate, right? However you want to handle that, because I don't think that his play has been so terrible. Especially, I thought last year he played a little bit better, and the year before he played better than the year previous to that. I do think that he's still, serviceable at the position. It's a position that's hard to fill, and that now it adds to an already difficult list to kind of fill this offseason. You're putting a lot into the Nate Thomas basket that you've got kind of up and down results from last year. It just would feel a lot more comfortable if you gave Thomas one more year to kind of develop and solidify that situation. Maybe Cornelius as well. And you need the money, but I think it's probably going to cost you that much, or the equivalent in draft picks in order to replace a starting right tackle.
Okay, so if you're not touching Terrence Steele's salary, then you have to do something with Kenny Clark, who has a cap hit of $21.5 million. Now you could extend him, you could cut him outright. I'm open to either. I think either one is realistic. What do you think they do here?
I think they extend him just based on the language that we've heard about him since the end of the season. One of the things that Jerry actually came out and said is he want to make sure to build around his young players on this defense. And the first 3 players that he mentioned, by the way, as we talked about, was Quinnen Williams, Osa Odigizua, and Kenny Clark. So I do think that they do have plans for him. He's part of the reason that they went out and got Christian Parkers, because I think they wanted to play specifically more of these defensive tackles. So I think he's in their plans. I think in order to keep him in their plans, they need to restructure that deal. And I think an extension makes the most sense there.
You do an extension, very likely you're going to save $15 million against the cap. And now you're talking about having $20 to $25 million of cap space. And that's with the idea that you're keeping George Pickens on a franchise tag number that's at $28 million. That's assuming you're not touching the Deron Bland and the Osa Odigizua numbers. And again, that's assuming that you're spending $11 million total on 2 backup interior offensive linemen. That would give you plenty of space to go out in free agency and sign Javonte Williams and sign a defensive end. It's not going to be that difficult. That's the point. It's not going to be that difficult for the Cowboys to get to $20-30 million of cap space.
Yeah, and if they do sign George Pickens, then that gives them even more money to
Correct.
play with, because that first year is going to be lowered cap hit number. So yeah, there's lots of mechanisms to kind of get where they need to get underneath the cap.
All right, so let's assume that they do free up $20 or $30 million. What could they use that money on, and who are some of the top targets out there? We'll get to that next. This episode is brought to you by TurboTax. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax Full Service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or the guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person, or you can connect online. They're going to handle everything from W-2s to self-employed forms and work to get you every deduction possible. It's a huge time saver, and it gives you real peace of mind knowing that an expert is handling it all. And so for a limited time only, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen every single day. If you're not an everydayer, check out the new Everydayer Club. You're going to get ad-free episodes to the Locked On Cowboys podcast for just $5 a month. Go to lockedoncowboys.supercast.com or tap the link in the show notes to learn more. All right, Landon, our next question is, we've heard a lot of rumblings that they could potentially be more active in free agency because of some of the cap space that we expect them to have. Could defensive end be a spot that they target some veterans on the market this offseason?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's clearly one of the spots where the Cowboys have the most need. We've mentioned it as a spot where they're clearly looking to upgrade the position, and whether that is through the draft or through free agency, I think depends on what's available and where they're picking. Obviously, I certainly think that if they're able to free up some money with the mechanisms that we just laid out, that it does make some sense to spend and go get at least one or two of these starters that you need on defense in free agency. And I think defensive end seems like it's a class that you can kind of shop at a bunch of different price points, right? And a bunch of different price levels. So yeah, I think we'll talk about. I mean, I think you've got a list here.
I've got a list. Let's go through the different price points.
Talk about it.
Yeah. Let's start with the top one. It's Trey Hendrickson, who was on the franchise tag last year. Didn't play a lot because of a back issue. Spot Track right now is projecting him at $25 million. My guess is he's going to take like a 2-year, $52 million deal. Would you be interested in that?
I think there's some interest there for me. I think 25 is pretty pricey, but I mean, honestly, like there's folks out there talking about paying Max,
Max Crosby,
Max Crosby, like almost $6 or $7, $8 million more than that after trading 2 first-round picks for him.
Correct.
Which, I'm not interested in. So I think, if the alternative is to get a guy that is just a very good pass rusher, and we'll figure out the run part of it a little bit. I think that price point's a little bit, better. My concerns
He's
here.
such a good pass rusher that, like, if you get him one-on-one, he's going to create pressure. And I understand why there's an appeal there.
Yeah. My concern is, does this defense make it more difficult for him to finding him kind of sewn into to certain packages, right? Like, how does he play can he play on 2 feet as opposed to with his hand in the dirt? Which, you don't necessarily need him to do that. He could be like a down lineman that you're rushing the passer on kind of 4-down nickel pass rush situations. It's just like, it kind of limits your ability to deploy him. So
Sure.
I think that, plus the age, and the kind of, one-dimensional aspect of his game, it gives me some pause, but I'm certainly not going to be shocked if we hear the Cowboys are sniffing around this situation because they feel like it's a cheap way to certainly really, really upgrade their pass rush right away.
The next 2 guys in terms of money would be Jaelan Phillips, who the Eagles traded for at the deadline. I would assume that Howie Roseman's going to do everything possible to try to keep him. His number's about $20 million. He's 26 years old. He obviously has experience playing in Christian Parker's defense. Now, there's a lengthy injury history, not only in the NFL, but also going back to college and high school. The other name that I wanted to mention, who is projected to make $18 million, and this guy's older, but he's still awesome, and that's Khalil Mack, who's 34. He's had plenty of experience playing as a 3-4 outside linebacker, and with his hand in the dirt. He's still a really good overall player, but you are probably just renting him for a year.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think that I would almost feel better about renting a Khalil Mack, right? Because, I mean, look, I think he's had his own set of injury concerns over these many years, but not quite as, consistent as you've seen with Phillips. And that's the other thing, is that Phillips is young, right? So, I
8
tend to
years
think
younger.
Yeah, but I also my concern is that with Phillips is that you're getting into bed long term with him, right? Like, I don't think he's going to sign a short-term deal, and
Probably not.
And I think that's the difference between what Howie Roseman did last year and, maybe the point in which the risk goes too far, is that, Howie wasn't committing to Phillips long term. If Phillips, had another injury, another lower body injury, it would have been easy for Roseman to just go, okay, well, we tried, but it didn't work out, and we'll just try again next year. If you're committing to a long-term deal with him, you're incurring a lot of that risk because of all the time that's involved there. So I think I probably would go around a Khalil Mack in that situation, just because I think there's also a benefit just adding another veteran body to that room, and just having his voice in there would be nice. So I think I probably would go that route, even though he's obviously 8 years older than
2 more, and these are the guys like in the mid range, and again, depending on the source, somewhere between $12 and $17 million. Kwity Paye, former first-round pick by the Colts, he's actually kind of progressively gotten worse as a pass rusher over the last couple of years. And then an old name, K'Lavon Chaisson, who we probably remember well. He was really good in the playoffs for New England. However, he has not been a good player in the NFL. He's not been somebody that's been reliable at all. Are you betting on somebody who is, he's going to be 27 this offseason, that he's finally starting to break out? Still a very poor run defender, but did have a big postseason. Are you willing to spend 12, 15, 17 million for one of these guys?
I don't love that shopping tier just because of the stock, right? I'm not really. Both of those guys are pretty pricey, and it comes with pedigree, not with necessarily production. So I kind of would have maybe avoid those two.
Okay. Another one in that same tier is Joey Bosa, who played well for the Bills last year. Now, they did a good job of managing his snaps, but he'll be 31 this summer. Still one of the best pass rushers in the league. According to PFF, he had the 10th highest pass rush grade. Not a run defender. Going to have to manage his snaps a little bit, but are you interested here?
Yeah, I think I'm interested in the same way that, the Khalil Mack situation interests me a little bit. I mean, I think the numbers would have to be right, but I think he's interesting because I'm not having to commit. there's a lot of risk in all these guys that you
Yeah.
mentioned so far. And to me, I like the guys who have produced and I don't have to commit to long-term, because that's the route that you probably should go in free agency, because otherwise you're probably overpaying quite a bit.
One more name that I find really interesting, and this guy might be done. He'll be 35 this year, and that's Kyle Van Noy, who has experience playing in just about every defense. He had the second highest coverage grade of any defender with at least 50 coverage snaps last year. He's an awesome run defender, doesn't give you much juice as a pass rusher, but he does fill in a role of like one of these edge guys that sets the edge, plays the run, and can spot in the coverage.
Yeah, I mean, again, depending on the price point for him,
It's been about $5 million each of the last couple of years. It's right about his range.
I'd do that. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think he adds a veteran presence. Like you said, you have a need at run defenders on the edge, right? You this is kind of the Jadeveon Clowney shaped hole that he could fill. And I think that, he's pretty decent in coverage, like you mentioned too. And just having that, again, we've got a lot of young players on this defense, and we're going to have even more young players in this defense. Having another veteran presence who is a good player and experienced, I think that has a value add that the Cowboys probably could look into.
And honestly, I think my two favorites would be, instead of spending $25 million for Trey Hendrickson, if you could go with like a Khalil Mack at, let's say, $18 million for 1 year, and then you bring in somebody else, like a Jadeveon Clowney. And again, I know those are older edges, but two guys that have played in a lot of schemes, that are good against the run. They're not going to be double-digit sack guys, but guys that you just feel really good about adding to your rotation. I think that's how the Cowboys can win in free agency.
Yeah, I agree. And honestly, there's other guys too. I mean, you could easily bring Fowler back at a pretty decent price, and I think I would be interested there as well. So yeah, it's certainly, the stock is not empty there. Maybe not the number one pass rusher, but lots of valuable starter level guys that you could pay decent money to and get good production.
So should the Cowboys be looking at different types of edge rushers in the 2026 NFL draft now that we know they're going to a 3-4? We'll debate that and more next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The winter games are officially here, and if you're anything like us, you're locking in for the events that you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years, and that's why following the winter games on FanDuel just makes sense. From medal counts to individual events to finding your angle on the sports that you care about the most, FanDuel gives you more ways to stay connected to the action. I love the curling matches. I mean, they've been so fun. They get so intense. My wife really likes the speed skating and the figure skating. She gets really into it. Plus, the hockey games just feel different right from the opening faceoff. FanDuel keeps the entire Olympic experience engaging from start to finish. So the winter games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen every single day. Landon, this last question comes from Mark. He wants to know, should we be looking at the pass rushers in the 2026 draft a little differently now, knowing that they're going to have more 3-4 looks, knowing that these guys are going to have to play in space, dropping into coverage more? Has that changed how you're evaluating any of these guys?
I think if anything, it's, look, it's a consideration, right? Like if you're going to be dropping into coverage, maybe a little bit more than traditional, hand in this dirt 4-3 defensive end, you certainly need to look into the ability of those guys to how they operate in space, how they play in space. You're not asking these guys to do complicated coverage gymnastics, right? You're not asking this guy to drop out and cover really even ask them to cover a tight end or a running back, or to go out, certainly not to go out, step out and cover a corner. Like, it's not the same kind of coverage that even a will linebacker in a traditional 4-3 would do, right? Like, it's more of a guy that's dropping into a zone, dropping into the flat, right? And then just being a big long-armed guy who gets in the way of passes, essentially, right? So there is an element that you want to evaluate, because you want to see these guys, how quickly they can, move and how they flip their hips, because you want to see how quickly they can get out to where they need to go. But I don't think we should over evaluate that aspect when, looking at these edge players. And I actually think if anything, this move opens up the door for more edge players, because I think you can tolerate playing with let's use Cashius Howell from Texas A&M, or, any one of these kind of more undersized guys that like have really nice pass rush skills, maybe play at a high physical level, but aren't, 260 pounds, that aren't 6'6" or 6'5", right? I think it allows you to, especially in this class where you have, this kind of sawed off pass rusher style that is, very prevalent, especially in the front part of the draft. I think that this defense allows the Cowboys the opportunity to play with more of those players because you have more bigger bodies on the field elsewhere.
Yeah, we should also mention like Jaelan Phillips, who played 17 games last year. He was in a scheme that dropped him into coverage more than most guys. I think Byron Young of the Rams had the most coverage snaps. It was 148. Jaelan Phillips wasn't that far behind with 84. So you're talking about on average dropping back into coverage like 5 times a game, which it's not nothing, but it's not like we're asking these guys to cover on 20, 30 snaps a game. Like it's just not that big of a deal. I do wonder if guys like, I'll give you a name, TJ Parker, who I think is your traditional 4-3 hand in the dirt defensive end. I wonder if someone like Cashius Howell, who you just mentioned, isn't a better fit just because he's way more comfortable in space than someone like Parker, and even someone like Keldrick Falk, who is 270 pounds. Maybe, I mean, that's never bad to have those kind of guys out there, but I do wonder if a Howell would be more intriguing to them.
Well, and I just wanted to bring up that point too, because Falk is a good example. I do think the Cowboys still need that 260 to 280 pound body type because this is a multiple front. It's not just going to be a 3-4 front. They need that body type. So I wouldn't rule out that type of body type, but I think, yes, I agree that, when you're evaluating guys and you've got Parker and Howell's tags touching potentially, you don't have to give the deference to Parker because he feels like he can play with his hand in the ground. It just opens it up a little bit more for you feel like you can accept more body types because you have more ways to solve the problems when they're on the field versus when 4-3 that's more traditional.
Oh, and maybe it's probably going to depend on what they do in free agency as well. If they bring in like a Kyle Van Noy and you've got Ezra Raku, Van Noy, you've got James Houston, who's another undersized edge that can play in space. Let's say you bring back Clowney. Maybe you have more of a need for that 270-pound guy that can set the edge. But if you're looking for somebody that can give you more juice as a pass rusher, I think that's where someone like Hal or David Bailey, obviously who you would need to draft high, or Arvell Reese become a lot more appealing.
Yeah, and I think that's the good thing is that you have the good and the bad. You have kind of needs in several different spots on the defense, just in the defensive ends room. And the good news is that you have all kinds of different body types to choose from in this draft and in free agency.
All right, that is it for today's show. We'd like to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. If you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Cowboys ad-free plus members-only Discord access and so much more. Head over to lockedoncowboys.supercast.com to join the club. And for those of you on video, we can send you the first ever 24/7 national NBA YouTube channel, and on audio, make your second listen the Locked On NFL podcast. Follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus _Mosher, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow.